Hello, Gianlucas. How are you?
Good morning to all our distinguished speakers, our panelists, and guests joining us today. More recently, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has already sent 2 warnings in a space of 3 years. The first was sent in 2018, which warned that if we fail to limit the rise on our global, on the average global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius by mid-century, we will face catastrophic disaster. By the second, sent 2 months ago, identifies Southern Africa as the climate hotspot and further stresses the need for climate stabilization, which is immediate and needs to be strong and sustained, and we need sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions as we are fast approaching the 1.5 degree limit. In Southern Africa, this translates to the region becoming generally drier, posing an existential threat to life in the region. I think we can all share and reflect on our own experiences on the effects of climate change already being felt. There is no other way to say this, but we need to act today. We may be too late, but if we don't act today, we may be too late. I apologize for painting such a gloomy picture so early in the morning, but this is our reality. As a young South African, I am scared. South Africa has recently submitted their updated NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, which are more ambitious than our first submitted almost 6 years ago. We may speak more about it during a moderated session. However, I do want to stress that our country is facing an energy crisis that needs urgent attention. For about 5 years, we have experienced power cuts in the form of load shedding, which has had a negative impact on our development in South Africa. Eskom has also recently been identified as the world's worst polluting power company. If we are to protect our country and its people and ensure that we build a climate resilient society in South Africa, that is where we begin. We need a well-facilitated energy transition that ensures that we are able to reduce our carbon emissions while ensuring that no one gets left behind. In exactly 18 days, the International Climate Change Negotiations, COP-26, will kick off in Glasgow. The goals of this conference, in no particular order, is to enhance climate action by pledging more ambitious emissions reduction targets that align with reaching net zero by 2050 in accordance with the Paris Agreement, finalizing the Paris Rulebook, prioritizing climate adaptation and mitigation efforts to ensure that our ecosystems and communities are protected, and mobilizing climate finance, which is key to addressing the climate crisis. These discussions are pivotal in ensuring that as the world transitions to low carbon economies, we are not left behind, that climate action is equitable and just. I welcome you all to this extremely important webinar focused on COP26 and the energy transition in South Africa, and set against the expectations from COP26, informed by scientific views and international best practices. During this hour and a half, we will draw on national and international insights into the challenges and opportunities for a just energy transition and accelerated climate action. This webinar will also explore the potential role of international partners in supporting a just transition in South Africa as the country moves towards a net zero emissions future. Just a few house rules before we begin our engagement. I would like to ask all guests to please mute their microphones if they're not speaking. We would also like to make the moderated session as interactive as possible. So please do share your comments and questions in the chat box. Alternatively, we have also allocated some time for further engagement, where I will ask guests to either raise their hand or pose a question on the chat if they would like to make an intervention. As we begin our engagement on this topic, I would like to firstly invite His Excellency Carlos Fernandez Arias, Ambassador of Spain to South Africa, to give some opening remarks. Thank you, Ambassador. Sorry, Ambassador, can you hear me? It seems you may be having a few technical difficulties. Ambassador, can you hear me?
Ditebogo, I wonder whether we shouldn't move to John Wade Smith and then come back to the ambassador.
Yes, I agree. Just in the interest of time, I would now like to I'd now like to give the podium off for opening remarks to Mr. John Wade Smith, who is the head of climate change and energy at the UK High Commission.
Ditebogo, Elizabeth, everyone, morning, and it's good to be here. And as you said, this is an important moment, and I'd like to just quickly pass on my thanks to both SIRE and also our Spanish colleagues for partnering on putting this together. Look, I'm just going to say just a couple of sort of big picture stuff, which hopefully will set a context. I mean, COP-26, as Ditebogo has said, is for us is seen as an incredibly important moment in time. 5-6 years ago, we got together in Paris, and we got to an agreement, and it was agreed that in Glasgow we'd come together and we would hopefully demonstrate to the global community that we as leaders are fully committed to meet the below 2 degrees and more like the 1.5 degree target that we signed up to. And it's really important for us as COP president that coming out of Glasgow, we are able to provide that incredibly important message. I think people are expecting it. You've identified the youth. I think everyone is looking to this as that, are we there? Are we serious? And as been set out, and we have sort of a number of key priorities, but the big ones are around ambition, demonstrating that we're on a pathway towards 1.5, at least a credible pathway towards it. Adaptation, recognizing the absolute centrality of the impact climate's already having on vulnerable countries. And obviously finance, an absolute critical element of the negotiation, critical element of the whole climate debate is around finance. How do we actually help support the financing, both in our own developed economies, but how do we support developing emerging economies make their transition? And I think this is about the just transition. I kind of want to highlight the fact that from the COP presidency perspective, just transition is seen as a core element of how we are looking to direct the conversations that are taking place in Glasgow. And we have submitted a just transition declaration that we are trying to encourage all developed economies to sign up to. And we would hope that all the emerging economies will endorse, because it makes it clear that we recognize that the effects of climate change disproportionately affect people in poverty, and it can exacerbate economic, gender, and other social inequalities. And the transition towards net zero will affect most acutely those in communities and economies dependent on carbon-dependent industries and production. In South Africa, absolutely a core element of the issue in the debate here. And we recognise we have a role in ensuring that climate change mitigation and adaptations are fully inclusive and benefit the most vulnerable through a more equitable distribution of resources. So we put this declaration out there, and we want people, developed countries, to sign up to it, ensuring that this is seen as an absolute core element of the work we do going forward, that we are looking as a development community to be supporting a just and inclusive and a fair transition that needs to take place. Bring it back to South Africa. As I mentioned, this is at the core of what South Africa is facing. No conversation about transition in this country should involve or omit the word just. And I think getting to a better understanding of exactly what just transition actually means, how do we best affect change, which is inclusive. But I think there's a key moment here as well, which is around the fact that just transition must be seen as a positive movement around ambition and around the growth agenda. It should not be used as an issue to slow down transition. We must be accelerating transition, but in a fair way. I think that South Africa is in a unique place, and I think they are coming to Glasgow with a nationally determined contribution offer, which is widely recognised as being ambitious, for which we are enormously grateful. We've encouraged all countries to come forward with ambitious NDCs, and South Africa has certainly met that challenge, which we recognise. It's very important that we focus on the ambition and the acceleration that needs to take place while addressing the just. We cannot palm and slow down the transition process, I think, because that's only going to store up further challenge and further problems, both for South African economy going forward, but also globally in terms of us trying to meet our 1.5 degree target. So I think what I want to conclude on that is, set in that context, is that in the South African context, there is an increasing interest, global interest, in finding ways in which we can help support South Africa's transition. We need to understand what that support looks like. What are we looking to support? What's on the table? What does a transition package look like? You will have all seen from reports in the press that a couple of weeks ago, the UK, as COP president, led a series of COP envoys to South Africa to have high-level discussions around the just energy transition transaction, opening the way and exploring a way towards hopefully what will be a high-level political agreement at COP to continue to engage and structure support which will be at scale that can help South Africa through this very difficult process that needs to take place. So I think the interest is there, and what we all need help on is in terms of understanding, okay, exactly what is the best interest of just transition in South Africa? How is it framed? How can we make sure that South Africa maintains the ambition towards the 2030 and beyond, but that we do it leaving no one behind? So I'm going to pass on to my Spanish colleague, His Excellency Carlos Fernandez Arias, and thank everyone for this. And once again, thank both Spain and SIA for pulling this important event together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you very much, Elizabeth, for putting that together. I couldn't agree with more with you, John, about the key element is how to help South Africa in a just and reasonable transition. Is a real problem. We know the figures of the South African energy are quite high in comparison to most of us. We have had in Europe, in other places of the world, the transition going on. We have commitments that we know that we clearly could reach in the next decades and find perhaps in our case in Spain we have a global objective of having reduced completely, abandon completely, or having carbon neutrality before 2050. I think we could actually do it, but the problem is not what we're doing us, but how to help our partners. There has been, you mentioned your delegation who came here earlier. There's a number of delegations who have been here also from the European Union, from Denmark, from Scottish also, and others. And we are all worried about how to help to get that just transition in South Africa. The goals is just to assist vulnerable sectors, certainly to promote healthier, more livable cities and rural areas, to boost rural development and to protect biodiversity. We are now in 2020. We reach targets lower of our carbon transmission that there were 30 years ago. So we are in a right path. And if we manage, what we need also is not only the help, financial and technical help. We have to make awareness of everyone in this country about the importance of the future of this project that we have in COP-26 and promote carbon neutrality in the production of energy. We have been present in South Africa for many years already, trying to and participating in the 5 rounds of tenders in the last years, both in solar, photovoltaic, thermosolar and wind energy. We have reached, our companies have reached a capacity of 1,500 megawatts, mainly in photovoltaic, but also in wind and thermosolar plants in the northern, in most regions, but also particularly in Northern Cape, Katu area, here in Eastern Cape, etc. And the commitment is wants to be steady and to help them. But as you mentioned, it's not the presence of technologies that the companies are bringing here, but also the awareness, both of government about this, the importance of the project, the future of the well-being, and actually the economy in South Africa moving into non-carbon energy. And we have to do a very strong effort on reaching the public opinion, in particular those who in more rural areas than urban areas, their work and their income is very much linked to carbon production and to mining, transport, etc. There's a big job ahead of us, and we have to be, these teams should be agree and should be really well decided on working together to reach that aims that COP is deciding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think both you and John have mentioned very important points that I think we can take out extract from your input. One is that just acknowledging the importance of a just transition, I think, is also just very important in itself, but acknowledging the fact that we also need to create awareness and get people also involved. That also goes with sharing the understanding of what a just transition actually really means, and reaching vulnerable communities as well and vulnerable provinces. But what I'm really also getting, and what I'm feeling really encouraged about as a young person as well, is your commitment to helping us as well reach a just transition in South Africa, and facilitating that for us, helping facilitate that as well, I think has also been very inspiring for me, for one. I'd like to hand over to Ms. Elizabeth Sideropoulos, who will also be giving an opening sentiment.
Thanks, Ditebogo. I'll keep my remarks to 5 points, taking a sort of a broader prism. Firstly, let me say it's been great to host this together with the Embassy of Spain and the UK High Commission, and it feeds into a series of projects and processes that we at SIRE have also been working on. But let me just highlight 5 points that I think are relevant and useful in the broader conversation. The first is that I think in the last 18 months, the climate emergency debate has become more intensive. And I think part of it has been precipitated by the realization that, you know, there's been significant fiscal stimuli that have been pumped into economies, both in the developed and in the developing world, to counter the pandemic, and that this could actually be used as an opportunity really to build momentum, to begin that shift in a really with significant resources to transforming economies and less carbon intensive energy and so on. So I think that's a positive point, right? I think another positive point has been that if we look at some of the biggest private sector companies in the world, there has been a shift, a more pronounced shift to recognizing the importance of needing to make commitments around climate change. The big thing here is to hold them accountable, of course, but I think in the last 18 months, again, you've seen a number of big companies making these commitments, and also much more debate and discussion around ESGs. I think there is still quite a bit of work to make sure that the intersect between ESGs and SDGs are entirely consonant with each other, but I think these are also positive moves in the right direction. The third point is really looking at some of the biggest actors in the climate in climate change. because that also impacts on both some of the points that both the ambassador and John identified, and has an impact also on South Africa. It's important to see that the US is back in the climate change discussions in a positive way. I think it's also been very heartening not only to see Chinese commitments a couple of years ago, or was it last year, I can't remember now, in terms of its own decarbonization by 2060, and of course the announcement at the UN earlier in September around ending support for coal-fired power stations abroad. We are seeing how difficult that transition is, even in the Chinese context, with significant resources, and so this is also a bit of a reality check, I think, for other developing countries. But those commitments are important because, you know, they're setting the vision in the future. And then, of course, the EU's Green Deal, its carbon border tax adjustment, that will play a really significant role in setting standards and actually driving change. And that change obviously has to be managed in a positive and constructive way in the context of a just transition. The fourth point I want to make is that it's really, our focus is on COP-26, but I think it's also important not to forget a couple of other processes over the course of the next 3 months, which will also be relevant, I think, for discussions around the just transition. The first of those is the WTO, the 12th Ministerial, WTO Ministerial, because we know the climate is, there is an intersect with trade, there is an intersect with intellectual property rights when we're talking about technology transfers and so on and so forth. So the WTO and the Ministerial that's happening are very important to look out for. There is, of course, from a least developed countries perspective, the meeting in early 2022, the LDC5. There are a series of processes around replenishment of IDA 2020 and the African Development Bank, which are critical in the context of climate finance. And then I think very interesting, the debates also happening within the IMF, not only about SDRs, but about a climate change mandate for the IMF. And the last point I want to then make relates to South Africa. Deepak, you painted, as you said, a stark picture early. I want to give it I want to look at what has been positive in the last few months. We've seen, I think, the government really gather momentum on the urgency of action on transforming our energy footprint. We've seen that at the international level with the way in which we've engaged the G7, at the G20, the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment. I think the president's announcements around 100 megawatts has also been extremely positive. Eskom's sort of announcements around the just transaction, I don't have it correct, just transaction transition. This morning in the Business Day, the announcement by the Development Bank of Southern Africa that one of the world's largest global investment management firms has extended a 3 billion rand loan to refinancing its green loan book. All of these are really important developments. And what we have to make sure going forward is that as a country, in terms of how we manage the just transition, we keep moving forward. I'm sure there will be areas where we will have to recalibrate, but I think that ambition has to be there and has to be driven. And I think we have built over the last probably 6 or 8 months a really solid foundation for doing that. One of the things that I do want to just mention in closing is that at the Institute, climate change, sustainability are becoming a really core focus of a lot of our work, not least also in our youth engagements that you and colleagues have been very involved in, Deepak. But we've also been looking at South Africa's climate diplomacy, and then very specifically in terms of internal focus, looking at the opportunities the green hydrogen economy creates in terms of reskilling. And that really is an essential element of the just transition, and that's part of the work that we've been doing with the UK High Commissioner under its UK Pact umbrella. So, from our perspective, we're really keen to sort of make a useful contribution, both in terms of engagement with youth and participation, but also in the policy environment on these very important issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. And I think you weren't closing up the whilst you were closing up your opening remarks, you were opening a much broader discussion that we're going to be having soon on the moderated discussion that we'll be unpacking soon. But I think the messaging that I'm getting from all three of the opening statements was we are moving forward and we are doing a lot, and which that's very inspiring and also very encouraging. Also just knowing that we are set in the right path, and there's a lot of processes happening concurrently to ensure that the just transition is facilitated both internationally as a world, but also in South Africa as well. I'd now like to transition into the moderated session discussion. And firstly, I'll start off by introducing our panelists, and then I'll start asking the panelists questions, and that way we'll facilitate then an open discussion between all four of us. Thank you so much to our opening speakers. I'd firstly like to introduce Mr. Alex Beckenstein. Alex Beckenstein is the head of the program head, of the Governance of Africa's Resources Program of the South African Institute of International Affairs, which he joined in November 2010. His work in SAIA has focused on several resource governance related issues, particularly in the fields of fisheries, ocean governance, mining, climate, and the energy just transition. The second panelist that I'd like to introduce is Dr. Jan Lucas Menzer Barakuerta. Dr. Menzer is an environmental chemist with a PhD in natural sciences from the University of Kiel in Germany, and spent the part of 2018, 2019, and 2020 working with the University of Stellenbosch. His work has been focused on Atlantic global biochemical cycles. More specifically, he has been working with the oceanic, carbonate chemistry system, which we all know as ocean acidification. Currently, he is the chief executive of an environmental consultancy company that focuses on urban planning development and sustainable energy assessment in Spain. The third panelist that I'd like to introduce is Mr. Deepak Patel. Deepak is a chemical engineer and a qualified artisanal brewer with an MSc in development economics from the University of London and an MBA from the University of the Witwatersrand. He joined the South African Presidential Climate Commission in June 2021 as the head of the climate finance and innovation. He leads his team in his work in the areas of climate finance mapping, financing a just transition, and developing a strategy for financing the pathway to a net zero emissions target for 2015. The PCC was established and is chaired by the South African President, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa. It is mandated to advise on all aspects of South Africa's climate change response. Prior to joining the PCC, Deepak was a special advisor to the Minister of Public Enterprises from 2018 to 2020. The last but not least, the final panelist is Mrs. Olivia Rumble. Olivia Rumble is a director of climate legal with 10 years of legal experience, specializing in environmental law, energy law policy and governance, climate change, focusing both on adaptation and mitigation, climate finance, carbon markets, and carbon tax. Olivia is admitted as an attorney at of the High Courts of South Africa in Gauteng and in the Western Cape, and holds a PPE, Politics, Philosophy and Economics degree from the University of Stellenbosch, an LLB from the University of Cape Town, and an LLM in Environmental Law from the University of Cape Town with distinction. Welcome to all our panelists, and thank you so much for joining us today. To kick off our discussion, I would like to invite Mr. Alex Beckenstein to lay the scene for us by providing an overview of the energy transition in South Africa and Africa. Alex, please do share the challenges and opportunities as well.
Absolutely. Let me start with the Africa region as a whole, because some of the challenges I think that we're dealing with in South Africa are not entirely unique, but quite specific to the national context here. So very briefly, if we look at the region as a whole, I think maybe a starting point is just to recognize that just the basics of energy access remains a major challenge on the continent. The stats are constantly changing, of course, but somewhere between 50 and 60% of Africans do not have access. That has obvious implication, job creation, but there are also health and environmental implications of reliance then on biomass, something like wood and charcoal for home cooking and so forth. So a real challenge on the continent, a massive need for expansion of electricity access in rural areas and remote areas. You know, often you find a lot of the infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, focused around the state capital, the larger cities. That point about safe and reliable is also very important. You know, most of us with experience on the continent know the stories of blackouts and intermittent power supply, the costs of backup generation, both in terms of diesel and other sources, and as well just the cost of doing business of not. The electricity that is being produced on the continent is largely still fossil fuel based. It depends a lot on the resources available to the states. Gas is an important source of electricity in a number of states with those resources. Think Nigeria, Angola, Egypt. Obviously, I'll get to South Africa, but coal is very important here. We do see some renewable resources playing a big role. Traditionally, the large hydro schemes in certain countries, but that also creates its own challenges. And again, in terms of consistent supply, has been some challenges in the context of climate change as well going forward. So renewable energy has huge potential to help contribute to this picture, to a ramping up of energy access, especially if we think about both grid-based solutions and off-grid solutions. There's very innovative solutions and opportunities available for load settings that can make a real difference. There's some very, very interesting initiatives by local actors and with the assistance of international development partners to support those sorts of activities. But I think the picture is mixed. We do still see many African states continuing to at the same time as about the offshore gas in or ongoing exploration for oil. This is continuing while there is engagement and an opening up towards renewable energy production. So a mixed picture. Let's leave that there if we look at the region as a whole. On South Africa, I'm not going to spend too much time. I think the audience that we have here have a general sense of the key challenges. We've already heard it in some of the introductory remarks. The main point is we know there's an overwhelming reliance on coal-based power production in the electricity sector, partly because we have those coal resources and we also export coal. So coal is an important sector in terms of jobs and livelihoods and economic activity, and that can't be ignored. That's a big part of the discussion. We also know that the massive reliance on the single Eskom, the single state power utility, both in terms of generation and distribution. Renewable energy is becoming an increasing part of the mix. We have a very interesting and actually, in many respects, a very successful model of renewable energy, independent power producers.
Sorry, Alex, I think you cut off.
Fantastic innovation there. It's brought in a lot of investment. We heard from the ambassador reference to that. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Sorry, it seems you might be network might be disconnecting a bit.
Can you hear me?
We can't hear. No, we can't really.
Would
it help if maybe you turn off your
Sorry,
camera?
just 1 second.
Just turn off your camera.
All right.
Turn off your camera.
Is that better?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this. As I said, it's generally known. But in the Independent Power Producers, Renewable Power Producers Procurement Program, we have a very good model. But again, most people that are part of this conversation will know that there have been challenges around that in terms of policy certainty, in terms of uptake and available linking to available infrastructure. So while we have a very positive model and renewable energy investment has been growing, I think there's a general sense that we could be doing much more. The other point, again, it's been hinted at, is that there's a lot of contention around the speed with which the energy transition can and should be embraced, even within government itself. You've heard a lot of concerns about potential job loss, potential economic impact. So this is also politically a very complex issue that needs to be navigated with great care. I think that gives us a general sense. I do think there is definitely potential for the picture to change quite rapidly. Over the next decade or two, we are going to have many of our coal-powered power stations reaching the end of lifetime. So there's potential to escalate the transition, certainly. And we've seen some fantastic signals in terms of the moves to allow municipalities to procure their own electricity. And also what Elizabeth mentioned, own generation, regulations to allow own generation up to 100 megawatts without license. We're seeing moves by some of the big power users like mining companies to really embrace that. So there are very interesting moves. There's a significant potential, but we weigh this against some of the political resistance to the transition. It's not in all parts of government or part of society, but in some stakeholders. And I think also to recognize that while many coal-powered fire stations will reach their end of lifetime, we also have Ndupi and Kusile, two very large new coal-based power stations, and these will continue to be generating electricity using coal resources for many decades into the future. So I think there's a bit of a reality check that we need to give ourselves as we look at the overall power situation. But at the same time, we need to recognize that there is significant potential. And if the policy and the regulations are right, it can unlock significant investments. And we're already seeing signs of the country moving in that direction.
Thank you so much for that brief overview. I'd like to then pass on to Dr. Lucas to also just give us a brief overview on the energy transition in Spain and the EU, also just sharing your challenges and opportunities as well. Hopefully we can link them in nicely.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Saya, and the Embassy of Spain and the UK High Commission and all the organizers of this event. I would like to point out that my presentation will be more from a consultancy point of view. So we try to implement all the decisions and plans that are made at a governmental level. And we really need to praise all the efforts that are done to try and mitigate climate change and all the plans that are set. But from our point of view as well, there is also the need to highlight and try to criticize a bit the problems of the energetic transition. So I've prepared some slides, which I would like to share with you.
Please go ahead.
Yes, can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So, as Deepak said before, I had a PhD in natural sciences from the University of Kiel. I spent some time in Stellenbosch doing some postdoc research, and currently I'm the chief executive of an environmental consultancy company. And my main work as a scientist had to do with the ocean acidification, so with the capture of atmospheric carbon dioxide by the oceans, and therefore at the end you have a release of hydrogen ions and carbonate ions, and you get acidification of the ocean. And now I have moved a bit into the consultancy work, and I would like to show a bit what is the main issue of climate change that we are facing, that probably all the audience knows a bit. And this is known as the killing curve, which is atmospheric carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we can see that it has been increasing steadily over the last years, and the levels are much higher than what we have found in the previous 400,000 years. So all this data are from ice cores. And then here we can see the current level of after the Industrial Revolution. So we are at a very, very high level. So as the ambassador of Spain in South Africa mentioned before, let me put this mentioned before. In Spain, we have had now a new climate change law, an energetic transition, and we also have a sustainable energy law, which from the consultancy point of view, we try to implement in our projects and try that things work the best possible. But this is not always very, very easy. So the main objective of the Spanish climate change and energy transition law are the renewable energy and network, the disappearance of fossil fuels, and the mobility and building construction. And the main objectives by 2015 and 2040 is to have and install annually around 3,000 megawatts of power from renewable sources, the disappearance of fossil fuels, so that we will not give any new licenses involving the study, prospection, and exploitation of petroleum or gas, stopping of any investment that favor the consumption of fossil fuels, and promote biomethane and other synthetic fuels from renewable sources, including for air transportation. And regarding mobility and building, the main points that we should achieve is that by 2015, there should not be any petrol and diesel cars. From 2040, the selling and registration of cars and commercial vehicles will be banned that use fossil fuels. Before 2023, which is quite soon, councils with more than 50,000 inhabitants will need to implement areas of low emissions. And then there will be a compulsory to install electric charging stations in petrol stations, and the renewal of public inefficient buildings and restoration of 100,000 flats per year between 2021 and 2030. So these are the main objectives of the Spanish climate change law. From an environmental point of view, so we know we need to implement wind energy, photovoltaic energy, thermal energy, and all from our renewable sources. But then these projects, big projects, also have very huge impact on the environment and the landscape. So it's very urgent to have a smart planning of its territorial distribution and to protect sensible areas of environmental, cultural, and social values. For this, every big project involving photovoltaic energy fields, wind energy fields, they really need landscape impact assessments and cultural impact assessments and social impact assessments. And then we have also the issue, for example, here in Spain, that from the government's point of view, they are putting a lot of effort, for example, in the hydrogen energy, which at the end, it has very large production costs. And currently around 90% of the produced hydrogen uses natural gas as well. So there is a long journey to make hydrogen energy a real green energy. And then we have, I'm sorry if I'm criticizing maybe too much, but another problems that we see is that in all this energetic transition that we are having, and probably it's going to be faced all around the world, not only in Spain, it is not really taking into account the depletion of resources, material and energetic resources that feeds all the metabolism of the production and the consuming system that actually exists nowadays. And instead, we are supporting mastodontic projects, really big projects that require huge quantities of minerals, water, metals, and energies. So we are really keeping and enhancing this large-scale removal and extraction of natural resources. And this is at the end what has been bringing us to a destruction of the biodiversity and to rising global temperatures, and displacing also rural and indigenous communities from their areas. So at the end, we are really somehow keeping the actual basis of the socio-economical model and the benefits of the big capitalism companies. So, and here I would like to highlight two issues that I have found that is happening in Spain, and that are not really how things should be done. No? So there is a very large consultancy company here in Spain, which helps the government to secure funds for transition projects. But at the same point, a very important oil company also hires the same consultancy company to secure funds from the government. So therefore, we kind of enter in a vicious cycle where the oil company, so the big consultancy company is working for the government on one side and from the oil companies on the other side. So this is kind of a vicious circle. And then we have another example here in Spain. It's like for the large strategic governmental project about hydrogen energy. So the main private promoters of this green hydrogen energy are 4 important oil and gas companies and also Saudi Arabia oil company. So at this point, I would like to quote a quotation from Frida Kiniger, which is campaign officer at Food and Water Europe. And she states that in the energy transition, also in what is said is the just energy transition, we are having the same actors, the same technologies or similar technologies, same division of power structure and resources, same infrastructures, same dependency. And at the end, for the climate and the climatic justice that we really require, it can go to a same catastrophe. Maybe this word is a bit too hard, but we need to think about these things as well, also from a governmental point of view. So I think it's important that the stakeholders, that the governments also get to hear this opinion. And then I would like to just quickly mention what is the work that we do. So I just put here an example of a pyramid, how the decision-making process it's happening. So number 1 would be the governments and the international bodies with climate change laws, IPCC, COP-26, all these meetings. And then there is on the second level, the provinces and the municipalities, and then on the third level, the individual companies, private sector. And our work moves more to level 2 and level 3, and we try to implement actions to help mitigate and to adapt, and to help mitigation and adaptation of climate change and the problems derived from climate change. So we do this based on two major areas, which is climate energy action plans for municipalities. And then we do this as well about the urban master plannings. So here in Spain and in Europe, there is the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. And this means that every municipality that joins this this covenant of mayors, they are required to produce a plan of climate and energy transition, where they try to implement in steps of 5 years, of 10 years, different actions to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. So, and in this work, what we do for these municipalities is we try to calculate all their emissions, including emissions from transport, fuel and electricity consumption, industry emissions, waste production, emissions from primary sectors. And we also have a look on the greenhouse gases sinks, and also on the renewable energy.
Thank you, Dr. Lucas. Can I please just stop you here just so we can push the conversation forward a bit? I like your introduction of the policies as well, and I want to link it back, and maybe Olivia, if you could, I'd like to ask as well, just linking it back to climate policy, climate action as well in South Africa, and linking it back to the policies. I know that recently the climate change bill was tabled in Parliament. How can the climate change bill that was recently put to Parliament adequately address the just transition in South Africa?
Yes, we're all very excited. It's been sitting with Cabinet since 2018 now. Just a bit of background, I was heading up the drafting team of the climate change bill before it went to Cabinet in 2018. And I take full credit for everything that's right and blame others for anything that might be wrong with the bill. But yeah, so it's on its way to Parliament, and you would have seen in our NDC that we hinge a lot of the main objectives of our NDC around certain empowering provisions in the bill. So it's relatively instrumental for South Africa, particularly in terms of its just transition. And if you've had a chance to read the bill, it's quite interesting. It doesn't specifically set out the steps of how we will achieve a just transition. So compared to, say, for example, Spain, which has, you know, as Jan Lucas just illustrated, a very detailed climate change law. So it says, you know, we will achieve this much renewable energy, we will aim for X many off-grid infrastructure, we will have this many cars that are not fossil fuel-based. South Africa's law is very framework. And so we use the term just transition quite gently in the Act. So we introduce the term into, I would say, the lexicon of our national laws. We attempt to define it. We explain what it is to the public, and we introduce it as well in the principles of the Act. And whilst, you know, most people just skim through the principles and they think, oh, well, you know, it's a nice to have. Principles in environmental law are quite fundamental. They frame how you should interpret the legal duties in the law, and they also guide a court when understanding and interpreting and applying that particular law. And so the fact that we've embedded the just transition within the principles of our Climate Change Act elevates it to a degree as a foundational principle of our climate change law, for want of a better word. And we also charge the P4C, the newly established Presidential Coordinating Committee on Climate Change, to deal with the just transition. And in this sense, we create a pathway or an architecture for that commission to decide how and when it will deal with the just transition. I know when the bill went out to public comment, there was quite a lot of input from the public asking for a lot more detail and substance. You know, can't we have more labor plans or social and labor plans that deal with how a just transition will be managed? Can't we have a minimum percentage requirement of, for example, people that are reskilled and redeployed into greener jobs? And I think the intention of the bill is to rather frame the overriding principles, objectives, and plans that we are seeking to achieve as a country, and then to embed that type of detail within the plans. And it strikes quite a difficult balance between detail versus overarching principle. And for those of you who are interested, what the bill sets out to achieve is this thing called sectoral emission targets. And I think those are going to be one of the primary vehicles that we start seeing South Africa, well, one of many vehicles that pushes South Africa onto a greener economy pathway. So sectoral emissions targets are targets that are effectively, if you could look at our national emissions as a pie, and we have the energy sector, the transport sector, agricultural sector, and we divided up that pie and we gave different allocations of that pie to different sectors. And that single pie represents our national carbon budget that we want to achieve as a country. And we divide it up amongst sectors to say, okay, your sectoral emissions target will be X, transport sectoral emissions target will be Y, and so forth. And that way we have a relative degree of certainty that if we collectively add all our different sectors together, we will ultimately still fall within our national budget. And I use that term quite loosely. We call it our national emissions trajectory under the bill, sorry. And the idea is to try and put a level of constraint around certain sectors. We know that our energy sector, for instance, operates under the IRP and various other planning instruments. And the vision is to align those other instruments, in particular the IRP, with national climate policy, particularly our national emissions trajectory. So in a sense, whilst all laws are equal, what the Climate Change Act seeks to do is to create almost an umbrella framework to pull other sectors in and to align them with our national emissions policy. So it's a very inspiring act. We've been applauded by the Grantham Institute on Climate Change. They're a UK-based organization for having the most publicly consultative and elaborate climate policy. Others will say it's convoluted and deeply complex, and I'll agree with both. We have incredibly complicated climate change legislation in the country, but at the same time, it offers huge opportunities for us to tap in and explore to quite a level of intense detail how we can harness emissions reductions across all sectors of our society. And also I was thinking about this quite a lot before our call. I'm a lawyer, so I will always promote law as a useful instrument for reforming society. But, law is also a very slow beast. So it can take, 5-10 years to come up with a final statute. Our national air quality law took 10 years to finalize. So the fact that we came up with a climate change law in 3 years is pretty phenomenal. But where I'm going with this is that what's wonderful about a climate change law is that it really entrenches national policy. So it immunizes it from regime change, as we've seen in the US to a degree. And a recent review of the UK's Climate Change Act came up with a similar conclusion. It said that it really entrenches policy, helps to steer and give direction to different government departments, and provides more coordination amongst governments. And that has been cited as one of the biggest issues impeding our just transition, is that there's a lack of coordination between different government departments. So absolutely, I'm very excited for the bill, and I think it gives us a huge amount of opportunities.
Thank you so much for just explaining that and unpacking that a bit more. What I want to do now is go to Deepak, to maybe from the Presidential Climate Commission side as well. We know that recently the updated draft of the NDCs was adopted. Please, can you share a bit more about the implications of the NDCs, and also maybe a bit more about how the just transition as well can be facilitated and how you guys plan on facilitating that?
Thank you, Deepak. Mindful that I might run over time, please feel free to give me a signal 1 minute in advance so that I don't cut my sentence short and I have a chance to round up. But I just want to say that listening to all the speakers, and in particular now to Olivia, we've come a long way as a country in taking our rightful place in the world of climate change, making no excuses for our current state while still being committed to a trajectory, hopefully towards net zero for ourselves in 2050. I think I also want to start off by maybe a little bit of a disclaimer. While the Presidential Climate Commission, that's what we call it, in the bill it is P4C, Presidential Climate Change Coordinating Council, until that bill becomes an act of parliament, as the PCC, we still operate in that gray zone where by behest, by virtue of having the president as our chairperson, we have, I guess, a coordinating, facilitating, cajoling, threatening, and sometimes independent advisory role, which we believe we've discharged quite faithfully and perhaps successfully. And if you look at, for example, the NDC and those people amongst the attendees who are getting tired of the jargon, I'm a newcomer, so I had no idea until a few weeks ago what an NDC was. An NDC is a nationally determined contribution. It seeks to have the sovereign state have its own integrity as a member of the Conference of the Parties. And those of you who are wondering what COP stands for, that is what it stands for, Conference of the Parties. And as South Africa, we decided or finalized our second NDC by virtue of a cabinet decision on the 14th. And of course, that NDC will go into whatever policy frameworks that need to be articulated in individual areas. But I just want to pause and say why we believe that this NDC that was adopted on the 14th is very, very interesting, ambitious, and progressive. In 2016, at the Paris COP, where the Paris Agreement was drafted, we had made a commitment, and I'm sorry to launch into numbers, but we had committed to a range of 398 to 614 million metric ton equivalents CO2. In this current nationally determined contribution, we have now, as a country, with a cabinet decision, committed to not only a tighter range, both bottom pulling down and top also pulling down. So we've actually tightened, but lowered the overall range. But secondly, made it progressive in the sense that it's not just a pie in the sky lookout to the year 2050, but in fact now commits us to achieving milestones along the way. And it's important to understand this. The milestones to 2025 is to be operating within the range of 398 to 510. And you'll see that the bottom of the range remains the same. However, the top of the range has been pulled down. And by 2030, to operate within a range of 350 to 420 on our way aspirationally to net zero by 2050. Why are these numbers important? They're important because, as both Olivia as well as a previous speaker pointed out, while the climate change bill hopefully becomes an act in the next short while, doesn't specify the pathway, what it does do is provides an overarching legislative framework within which all of the state actors as well as private actors need to be acting in concert. I have been observing the questions on next to the chat group, and I just want to say that there are questions, for example, relating to why there appears to be a contradiction between Minister Gwede Mantashe and what the president says in public. Without getting involved in politics, as the Presidential Climate Commission, what we appreciate is the fact that this path to net zero with a built-in non-negotiable just transition is a pathway that is going to be complex. It is going to be made up of multiple pathways. It is going to be quite onerous in the way in which it is implemented. And we, having committed to leave no one behind, have in fact given the Minister of Minerals and Energy the permission to both protect his constituency in the private sector, which is the mining and minerals complex, as well as, given where he comes from, we expect him to stand up for coal miners, coal mine workers, for communities around coal mines who have a dependency. So to answer that particular question, yes, it appears to be contradictory. No, it does not signify a cacophony, a noise that can't be managed. What it does signify is how much complexity there is in our just transition. I also, at this point in time, want to make a very quick technical point, and that is the new NDC that we've adopted with the upper and lower bounds of the range actually have a consistency, we call it, or a compatibility, we call it, with the upper end still being within no more than 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature in 2050. So the top of our range, regardless of what happens, we have committed to becoming part of the world that wants to achieve no more than 2 degrees Celsius. We also need to say that the bottom of the range is compatible with no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because we remain as a country committed to growth, economic development, as well as growth in jobs as we progress. And while we're committing to an upper bound that we will one way or the other comply with, because it's a commitment we've made, the aspirational target that approximates no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius is going to require assistance. And here I just want to refer both to the climate official from the UK High Commission, as well as His Excellency Carlos Fernandez from Spain, that I have heard the word help. We are seeing this as more than help. We are seeing this as an absolutely moral, economic, and historical commitment that the developed world must deliver on at COP26. So I don't want any misunderstanding to occur with respect to a helpful hand as if it's a charitable hand being extended to us. It is a well thought through top and bottom range bound NDC, which if you want us to help you abate the next metric ton of carbon, not millions of metric tons, metric ton of carbon, you're going to have to make a contribution to this process. So it's not just, yes, developing country, we're going to help you. We have also established, both through the climate change bill, although in softer language, and more importantly, through a series of dialogues that we have been having as the Presidential Climate Commission, a notion of what a just transition would look like. And within the next few weeks leading up to COP, through our dialogues, which have now been attended by thousands of stakeholders, both academic and professional, as well as ordinary people, we believe that what we are able to do is provide the South African government with a South African societal consensus of what, firstly, the non-negotiability of a just transition is, and secondly, what are the elements that make it up. And we are seeing this COP26 as the financial COP. Everything is going to succeed or die by whether there is a deal to be struck on the very critical question, what is the developed world prepared to put on the table in order to motivate, help if you want, but more importantly, make a meaningful contribution to the developing world, which still has to undertake its path to prosperity and development. In our context, given the high rates of unemployment, in our context, given how fundamentally powered our economy and society is by fossil fuels, if you are to ask us to keep our fossil fuel endowments stuck in the ground for the next millennia, we want a price to be attached to that request. What is a just transition? We are beginning now to amalgamate. It's very interesting that the whole notion of a just transition emerged, in fact, in South Africa with a COSATU debate and statement on that question more than 10 years ago. And they were basically saying, we have an economy that is essentially two economies. We have an economy that is not prefaced on service and beneficiation. We have an economy that is still pretty much commodity based. And the number of jobs that we do have, despite the high levels of unemployment, rely, in fact, on a continued extraction of those natural endowments that we have. And any talk of moving away from one or more of those naturally endowed minerals, resources that we have, would of necessity require not just the South African state, not just South African business, but in fact the international community to begin to find ways of ameliorating the losers, or compensating or finding ways of softening the blow to the losers of this transition. And we must say there are going to be losers of this transition. There is no longer any doubt that with the closure of coal mines, should we expand renewable and alternative energy sources for electricity production, there is no doubt that in Mpumalanga as a whole and certain key localities within the Mpumalanga region are going to become distressed unless we do something really substantial and meaningful to move them up a path of development that is either alternative to what they are doing now, or find a way of bringing them along with us as we move to higher level technologies. Which leads me perhaps to the last point that I want to make, because I think the discussion is very important, is the whole notion of technology. It is clear to us that as we go to 2025, 2030, and proceed to 2050, a lot of that is going to have to be accompanied by local industrial development that moves away from commodity mining and moves towards higher levels of manufacturing and beneficiation. And in general terms, while we haven't costed it, while we haven't clearly articulated a policy or an implementation pathway, we are seeing that the first low-hanging fruit comes from decarbonizing and greening electricity production, followed by a potential to electric vehicles, followed in turn by a development of green hydrogen as a substantial new technology that needs to be financed and assisted to grow in our country, so that what we have at the end of the day is even our commodities and our mining industry greened by virtue of hydrogen being the source of the energy that they need, rather than coal and or electricity. So as the Presidential Climate Commission, we are absolutely clear that a just transition is not a nice add-on. It's an integral part of our NDC. It is an absolutely integral part of the way in which we conceptualize the pathways to net zero for our country in the global and international geopolitical and economic context. And while there's a lot of details still to be worked out, I think what we do have is a country consensus leading up to COP-26 that allows the country to showcase, number one, the ESCOM Just Energy Transition Transaction as the first point and the leading edge of a decarbonization of our electricity generation sector, followed by a plan as well as the funding needs that are required for the just transition to ameliorate the negative impact on communities, societies, and workers, and in fact, small and medium-sized businesses, which have become dependent on the coal value chain, in particularly the Mpumalanga region. And then finally, also asking for technology transfer as well as technology financial assistance to begin to develop our own economic trajectory towards a green base for our economic future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Deepak. I think you really, you really shared quite a lot about equity, about financing, about justice as well, which are very important as well, principles as well, when we think of the just transition, not only the just transition, but climate action. I now want to open the floor to questions and answers, and if anyone wants to share any comments. But I think, Ambassador, I think maybe you want to share some, you're going to have a response to some of the statements said, and then we'll open the floor. If you do want to share a message, if you do want to ask a question, please do ask a question on the chat, or alternatively, you can just raise your hand. Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, no, thank you. I don't really to enter into a discussion. No, I do agree with what was just said. I mean, the commitment of South Africa is quite clear, and we are very happy to know that, and we are ready to participate in the way we could, and not only Spain, but also other countries on just on that transition, which is, I know, is hard and is difficult. And we perhaps I was not well understood. I don't think that what I wanted to say is that we want to accompany those countries, in this case, as ambassadors in South Africa, and the others who have to go into a transition, and to share the experience that we have had also going difficultly into our transition, decarbonizing little by little our energy, and we are ready to maintain our commitment on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start with the messages on the chat, but I don't see any hands raised at this moment. So I'm going to start with 3 questions, and any of the panelists can respond. The first question is, what place would natural gas or LNG play in the energy transition? And is South Africa still considering exploitation of the Barakuerta deposit in Tatum with its newfound enthusiasm for hydrogen? The second question, I think this is for Elizabeth. Thank you for your insight. My question is around the role and responsibility for the private sector in climate change, particularly on the impact of fossil fuel-driven corporate power in masquerading behind the net zero pledges. Coming from an ESG industry, the person that asked the question comes from ENG industry. The third question, which I also think is very interesting and important, is how can we start introducing the climate justice energy conversation in the political and legislative space, such as in the local election conversation currently taking place, as well as to the labor force in the country, particularly in the coal mining sector? I think this question will also be useful if you, Dr. Lucas, as well, also weigh in. I'm just sharing your experiences, excuse me, from the Spain side as well. But I do open the floor for the panelists to respond.
Deepak, do you want me to just go quickly?
Yes, sure.
Just on the ESG thing. Sorry, let me just call it up. I think the observation is absolutely correct, that there is this sort of disconnect between compliance and action. And I think, you know, ESG has been around for some time, but I think we're still in the phase of, you know, we have to have this, and it becomes a tick box exercise. I think as momentum picks up more globally, and we've seen that, I think, accelerate, particularly in statements that have come out of the G7, and no doubt will come out of the G20 summit, where the global regulation environment is hopefully going to become tighter. I think that is the first step towards addressing that in a much more meaningful way. But in order to, as always, you know, the issue about compliance and action is the issue of accountability and transparency. And I think there is a role there clearly for regulatory authorities, but there is also, I think, as with all things, a role for civil society, for advocacy groups to keep to account. So it's going to be it has to be a whole of society exercise, not just when we're talking about big corporate power, but in fact at every level when we're talking about the transition, both in terms of the just part of it, as well as in terms of the ambition to make sure that we can reach the aspirational goal of not more than 1.5 degrees, not just to South Africa, but globally.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Would any of the other panelists like to respond?
There was a question a little bit earlier from Sharon asking about what financial structures is South Africa putting in place to phase out or reduce coal dependencies and increase low carbon energy uptake. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention the South African Carbon Tax Act, which seeks to do exactly that. So it places a carbon price of 120 Rand. It's now, I think, 134 Rand per ton of CO2e, based on certain medium to large size emitters that are required to pay it on an annual basis. So that is one instrument that is pushing us towards, or that government has put in place, that is pushing us towards a low carbon future. And in the way that the tax is structured, it allows for carbon offsets to be used. And one way that you could buy an offset would be to purchase offsets from renewable energy activities. So again, that's driving the market for renewable energy projects within a South African context. But absolutely, it's a very valid question around how we as a country accessing or best utilizing all our financial options that are available. And climate finance is obviously a very relevant one, both at the COP and for us nationally. And there have been a lot of projects looking at how do we improve access to the finance that is already available. There's been a lot of bottlenecks. You may have seen in the news that the DBSA was recently asked to itself commit to net zero in order to receive accreditation under the GCF, which is kind of the main provider of climate finance. And there's a huge debate going around those issues. Those are some of the bottlenecks that we're experiencing. So in terms of increasing the number of institutions that are accredited to provide climate finance, to make it easier as well. So to reduce the conditionalities that are imposed on those finance, to reduce the cost of that finance. So for example, by requiring government guarantees, is that appropriate? There's quite a lot of discussion happening right now within South Africa, but also that's going to happen at the COP at the end of this year between us and our counterparts around how do we make it easier for developing countries to access the finance that is already on the table.
Thank you so much, Alex. I see your hand is up. Please respond.
Well, my connection doesn't seem to be too great, so I hope I can get across a response. I'm not sure whether this question was raised among the three that you listed. My connection was interrupted, but I saw a comment asking, essentially saying that South Africa is a developing and an energy-intensive country. And so can it, or should we expect it to be powered by renewables? And I thought that was a very important question, so I just want to jump straight to that. There's two parts of that. South Africa is a developing country, South Africa is an energy-intensive economy. Now, certainly from my perspective, I don't see anything in the nature of a developing country that would make it less able to embrace renewable technologies. There are examples of developing countries around the world, granted many of these economies are smaller, who are fully embracing renewable energy technologies. And indeed, again, the broader issue question around, for example, a country that has not got a fully developed electricity distribution network, there are significant opportunities or benefits really to dispersed off-grid power solutions. So I wouldn't it's not. I wouldn't want to focus too much on the developing. Sometimes there's an implication there. It's not stated explicitly here around this question of developing countries, which is more along the argument of saying that, well, developed countries went through this energy-intensive fossil fuel.
Sorry, Alex, you cut off a bit there.
Developing countries to embrace renewable or to embrace renewable energy technologies and not go through them. Sorry, am I back?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I'll try my best and I'll try to keep it short. What I was getting at is that there's sometimes an implication by this question of developing countries that developing countries should be allowed to kind of travel the same path that many developed countries have of going through heavy reliance on fossil fuel energy generation. I think my comment there is that if we want to position ourselves as developing countries, and South Africa and other developing countries, if we want to position ourselves in strategically in terms of
Sorry, Alex, I think you cut off there again.
The diplomatic aspect, sure, but economically, technologically, if we want to position us for growth and job creation.
Alex, I think you've cut off a bit. I think, can we please go to, just in the interest of time,
Sorry,
get a response from Deepak? It's okay.
Yeah, just like electricity.
Yeah, let's
is also
let's
a
move on. I'm
critical
sorry.
factor in successful operations in modern times. I'm sorry, I was finding that quite fascinating. I just want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the questions that were raised, and also then maybe respond in some ways to the point that I thought Alex was making. Firstly, there isn't a contradiction between development and moving, let's just call it up the renewable path. So any impression I might have created with my enthusiasm for justice by implying that, I sincerely apologize for it. I need to also say, again, quite clearly, that a number of investments have been made on the presumption that we are going to, in fact, exhaust those fossil fuel resources. And whether we like it or not, and here I'm venturing onto very thin ice, I understand that, off-piste actually, because it's not within the scope of what I'm allowed to say. Eskom has a reliance, despite its own shortcomings and despite its inability to produce the kind of electricity that our economy needs as we speak. It, however, is the largest single, as someone said, I think it was you, Deepak, at the beginning. It is the largest corporate emitter in the world. It needs to be helped to move away. And to perhaps Alex's point, what needs to happen is Eskom it already is happening, transiting into a 3-company or 3-operation future, in which we foresee that distribution is separate, competing with other private sector distributors. So I don't think there's any ideological issue or difference between my call for a development path and Alex's insistence, perhaps, that needs to happen through financially viable pathways. That's given. Secondly, what's of critical importance is what we call the grid. And the grid must be strong enough, must be prolific enough, must be multifaceted enough to be able to harness as well as distribute along long pathways, because our country is very big. Electricity, hopefully as efficiently as it can, from the point of generation, which in future we're hoping is more solar PV and wind, all the way through to metropolitan localities, which I think increasingly, given the 100 megawatt cap the cap being extended to 100 megawatts, is going to, I think, unleash a flurry of activity which we have nobody, I think, not us, nobody else is able to quantify what its momentum and multiplier effect is going to be. So that the future of electricity is going to be absolutely changed, no problem with that. What we are saying, though, is that if you expect us to acceleratedly decommission power stations from having an expected life of 50 to 60 years to now agreeing to a pathway that decommissions those in 30 to 40, 45 years, there is a stranded asset component that needs to be funded. So anyone who understands finance will understand that there's a stranded asset that needs to be funded because that investment has been made already. There are spurious arguments about what's the role of politics and what's the role of corruption over the years in giving us the Medupi and Kusile that we have. Well, we have them, and we have to work with them. One last point I think I want to make with respect to the just transition. We know that communities and workers are going to be negatively impacted. We need to find a very serious and progressive manner in which either individuals who are affected, or the lineages of the individuals who are affected, or the communities in which those individuals come from, are offered reasonable livelihoods to be able to sustain and hopefully improve the conditions of life as we undertake this pathway to a green economy.
Thank you so much, Deepak, for that. I think now we're going to be moving into a vote of thanks. I'll now like to hand over to Luanda.
Thank you. I do note that in terms of time, we had said we would end at 11:30. But perhaps because the conversation is still a bit interesting, those who are able to stay for maybe just a one round of questions, just one more, could we possibly allow that with your permission, Titebogo? given that there's still a lot of interesting points there by the chat and the Q&A. Or perhaps even allow our panelists to perhaps give us some key recommendations going into COP26.
Yes, I think I'd love for the panelists to give key recommendations going to COP26. And if they want to continue the discussion, I'm happy. I just have another meeting now.
I would be happy to stay for another 10 or 15 minutes, not much longer than that, I'm afraid, because my next meeting is, believe it or not, an in-person meeting, which needs me in the car to get there.
I think it just might be if there are any comments from Olivia, also from Jan Lucas, who haven't had an opportunity to come in, and then I think we can.
Yes, I have some final remarks or recommendations from my point of view, and knowing how the structure and how South Africa works and the difficulties that it has as a country. And as Deepak mentioned, so that there is a real need of a strong renewable energy energetic network grid system. But we also think that it will be very important for South Africa to try and invest in the decentralization and the self-supply of renewable energy, and not really the need to depend only on a national grid system. So it's quite important to decentralize and invest into the self-supply. So this would be, I have other recommendations and remarks that I could share privately, but I think this one is kind of the most important, the decentralization and self-supply of renewable energy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jan Lucas. I'm now going to hand over to Luanda, who will continue with moderation. Unfortunately, I have to leave because I also have an urgent meeting taking place now. So Luanda, the floor is now yours. Thank you everyone for joining us for today, and thank you for the fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Ditebogo. And before we lose you, I'd like to thank you very, very much for your very excellent moderation and steering this conversation today. So we understand you have another meeting, so we'll just carry on for maybe another 5 minutes just to allow Olivia to sort of give us some feedback from the questions, and then we'll give each speaker probably 1 or 2 minutes to just give their final thoughts, and then we'll go over to votive things. So thank you very much, Ditebogo. So Olivia, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Miranda. Let me make some final comments on the questions, and I have been typing furiously in the Q&A box, so you will see some of my thoughts there. But just going forward into this year's COP, it's a really exciting one because it's the biggest COP basically since Paris in 2015. And one of the major issues everyone's going to be talking about is climate finance. And I think South Africa has already been quite strong on its messaging around climate finance. Minister Creasy has, for example, put forward a climate finance target for 2025. And I think we should push hard on that number. I've seen proposals by developing countries that not only should we be really ambitious in our 2025 target, but that developed countries need to make up for the shortfall. So there's been like a 20 billion shortfall since 2016. Well, the latest number is 20 billion. And that needs to be made up incrementally for 2021, 22, 23, 24, as a way of at least, it doesn't cover a lot, but it's a demonstration of good faith that developed countries do take this sufficiently seriously. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot of discussions around, okay, increased ambition on condition of better financial support. And there's a huge push for net zero from the developed countries. And if that is truly what they're wishing to see from countries like emerging economies like South Africa and Brazil and India, I think we need a better articulated just transition financial package on the table. I know the CIF, for example, is seeking to provide climate finance for just transitions, but I think we need a better articulated view to give us confidence to commit to that kind of target, knowing that, you know, people in Mpumalanga and the wider communities, including women and youth, will be supported through that transition. And that means quite a much clearer articulation from not only developed countries, but the financial institutions like the GCF, the CIF, around how that type of finance will be provided. So Thank you for joining us today. And that's my last round of comments. It's been a really fascinating discussion with all of you.
Thank you very, very much, Olivia. And now I'm going to just ask all the panelists in 1 minute to sort of give sort of a key point that you think that South Africa should be advocating or advancing for in the next COP26 at Glasgow. So I'll start, I'll ask for this to go in this order. I'll start with Alex, hoping that perhaps he will be able to make his point without the network interrupting him. I'll ask Deepak to come after Alex, Olivia, and then Dr. Menzer. And Elizabeth, I'd also like you to also chime in on this particular one, and then we'll come to a close. So Alex, over to you. Okay, while we still try to get Alex, Deepak, can I perhaps just come to you?
Yes.
On that just final point.
Thank you, Luanda, and I'll be brief. We go to COP26 as a country which I think has its framework and hopefully its house in order. As you all know, the climate envoys, and those were basically the climate envoys from the Prime Minister's office in the UK, the office of the President in the United States. Now there, as you said, Elizabeth, back at the table. There was France, there was Germany, and then the EU also joined. And those meetings were very exhaustive over a period of a whole week. I think the final crossing of the T's and dotting of the I's are taking place as we speak. As a country, I think we are going to offer a decarbonization pathway with the financial ask that is quantified, including the just component of that particular endeavor at COP26. And I'm hopeful that at COP26, while we won't get the full package agreed by way of legal and terms, heads of terms, etc., I think we're going to get to a point where we understand each other as we stare each other straight in the eye and make commitments into the future. The final point I want to make, because it's a question that Jeff Davies raised, the question of the basic income grant, a huge debate. I'm sorry, Jeff, I'm not going to be able to do justice to that question on this call. Happy to take it offline. I think we are connected somehow, so you'll find me or I'll find you. To Saya, thank you very much for this platform. I think it's absolutely critical that a wide range of stakeholders, interested parties, and even lay people get given the opportunity to not only express their voices, but begin to understand how imperative it is that we undertake this chain, this journey to a net zero future in 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much, Deepak. So Alex, do we have you back?
Not yet, Luanda.
So Alex, perhaps you can just share that final thought on the chat if you are able to, but in the meantime, I'll just move on to Olivia for the final thought on what South Africa should be advancing at COP26.
Nothing further in addition to my earlier remarks, but just to echo what Deepak said, this is really, we're seeing the climate negotiations move from a top-down to a bottom-up model. So it's no longer just governments negotiating on behalf of people. We're seeing the local actors leading on behalf of governments, including in forums like this. And so I really want to thank our UK and our Spanish counterparts for convening these types of forums. The messages that come out from these conversations and others that are happening across the country are deeply impactful in their own way. So my thanks to all of you for inviting me to this.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Elizabeth, over to you.
Nothing much to add, just to thank the panelists. It's been really stimulating. I think the points that have been made in terms of South Africa's path and I think the ambition that it has put on the table. I think the fact that it has showed that the country is serious and but recognizing the challenges is I think the right thing. The big issue is finance, and I think Deepak said, this is the climate. Oh, was it Olivia? Climate finance is the central piece of COP26. If we're really going to be meaningful in any meaningful way, actually achieve not only our national ambitions but global ambitions, which means that developing economies also need to really accelerate their transitions, finance is going to be critical in that regard. I have to say I'm a little concerned about that, because we have seen that historically some of the climate finance commitments have not been met. I mean, in the stats from the OECD show that in 2019, I think the annual 100 billion was not reached again, and it was about $80 billion dollars that were committed in terms of climate finance. We're going to have to do much better than that, because that also might create an opportunity if you know, that package of, we will be ambitious, but you need to come to the party as the developed world, might also then help us with issues such as the basic income grant, which Deepak will take offline with Jeff. But I'll leave it there. Thanks, Luanda.
Thank you very, very much, Elizabeth. And just some acknowledgements before we close off. I'd like to give a big thank you to our opening session speakers, His Excellency Carlos Fernandez Arias, Mr. John Wade Smith, in his absence, and my Chief Executive, Elizabeth Sideropoulos. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists who have led a robust, thought-provoking, informative discussion in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow. That is Mr. Alex Beckenstein, Deepak Patel, Olivia Rumble, Jan Lucas Menzer, and a special shout out to Olivia and Deepak, who did had to shift their schedules around to accommodate this very important discussion. Thank you very much to you. Our moderator in her absence now, for steering this discussion in such an elegant and efficient manner. This, colleagues, was a joint undertaking between SAIA, the Embassy of Spain, and the UK High Commission. I would like to thank Christina and Jennifer from the Embassy of Spain and Punzo from the British High Commission. Colleagues, thank you. This would not have been possible without your efforts. And to Team SAIA, of course, who have been on the technical side of things and also helping us in the lead up to this event. I'd like to thank the events department, Sarasa Nandale and Nondomiso Ngunga. I'd like to thank our communications department, Nicolette Rebok and Spiwe Dlamini. And I'd like to thank my colleagues for support, Elizabeth and Alex Beckenstein. And of course, I'd like to thank our audience members who have joined us and engaged so nicely in the chat section and the Q&A. And we hope this conversation will be continuing on in the lead up to COP26 and even after COP. And with that, I'd like to declare this meeting closed. Thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.